Chapter 1. Sarah stumbled over a rock, falling to her knees on the abrasive ground. The tumble jarred her burning thighs, sending pain shooting through her knee and down to her toes, causing her vision to blur. A part of her wanted to give up, to let her enemies capture and kill her. The other part knew she had to fight, to avenge Preston and Rick, and make it back home to Lark. Her body was numb and tingly, and though her limbs still moved, they were weighted and rubbery. Quitting seemed like an easy option, but she couldn't, nor would she. Preston died to protect her, and she wouldn't diminish that by giving up when the going got tough. Her arms trembled as she pushed herself up from the ground. A sob tore through her throat as her right elbow gave out, and she collapsed back to the ground. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and fatigue had set in so long ago she couldn't even think straight. They'd been running for 2 days nonstop. Every time they attempted to stop for rest, Luna's men caught up to them. On several occasions they just barely evaded their pursuers. It was a miracle they escaped the Lunas to begin with. If the propane tank did not explode, who knows what would have happened to them? She shuddered at the thought. If they were caught, she'd be a prisoner and more than likely be raped and beaten repeatedly. And worse, they would kill Vincent. Despite her fatigue and injuries, Sarah knew she had to get up and keep moving. Her skin was still singed and red from the heat of the blast. They were barely far enough away from the blast to avoid serious injuries. Sarah! Vincent called after her as he jogged back to her. His warm hand wrapped around her torso as his fingers curled into one of her belt loops. Hoisting her up, he warned. Sarah, we have to keep moving. They are right behind us. Sarah forced her gelatin-like feet to continue forward. Luckily, Vincent supported most of her weight as they moved across the uneven forest terrain. I can't keep doing this, she croaked out. Her lips were dry and cracked from dehydration, and her whole body shook uncontrollably from exertion. Howls echoed off the forest wall. The wolves were getting closer. Even if her body refused to move, she had to find a way to carry on. You can, Vincent urged. He draped one of her arms around his shoulders, supporting even more of her weight. Come on, feet don't fail me now. We have to keep moving, and Vincent can't carry me. He couldn't go much longer, especially if he was carrying most of her weight too. You should shift into a wolf and run. I'm slowing you down. There's no point in us both getting caught. You can go for help, she argued breathlessly. As they ran through a thicket, her foot caught in a vine and she pitched forward. Vincent yanked her up by her belt loop, helping to right her. He gave her a grim look and shook his head. I can't. I'm too weak. It's been too long since I last ate or slept. Wolves eat a lot to ensure a safe shift. The amount of calories we burn during the transition is astronomical. It would be dangerous for me to shift now. Plus, I'm not even sure I could. Oh, Sarah murmured. We've made it this far. We just have to keep moving, he encouraged. Sarah looked around at their surroundings. Maybe if she set tiny goals for herself, it would keep her distracted and motivated, she mused. There was a fallen tree a few hundred feet ahead on her right. One step at a time, just to the tree. You can do this, she thought, trying to convince herself. But with her mind so focused on the task at hand, she didn't notice what was right in front of her. The ground sloped below them, and before either of them could find their footing, they were tumbling. Sarah screamed as her feet flew out from under her. Her right arm hit the ground hard and her body slid uncontrollably down the hill. Jagged stones embossed her skin while splintered branches jumped out at her, scratching and clawing at her face and hair. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Vincent, just ahead of her. His face was contorted in pain as they continued their rapid descent down the embankment. Sarah screamed as she was launched forward. She jutted out her arms to brace herself as she met the unforgiving ground. She groaned as a sharp pain ripped through her body. Black clouded her vision as something cool splashed against her face, causing her eyes to widen. She choked, gasping for air as water filled her lungs. Pushing up on her hands, she surveyed their setting. She was in a rapidly moving stream. Her hands sunk into the mud and she lay in a puddle of murky water. Sarah! Vincent groaned as he army crawled toward her, his face strained with every movement. I'm okay, she sighed, closing her eyes as she drew in deep breaths to control her frantic breathing. Come on, you have to get up. Vincent looked down at the rapids swirling downstream. He stared at the water a long moment before his eyes snapped to Hers. I have an idea, but I'm not sure if it will work. Anything's better than sitting here waiting for them to find us. She exhaled, sitting up. Dizziness overwhelmed her as a sharp spasm sliced through her head, causing her to clamp a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The numbness left her body and was replaced with white-hot pain everywhere. Vincent took off his shoes and threw them into the river. Give me your jacket, he instructed as he finally reached her. Without waiting for her reply, he ripped it down the center, sending the buttons flying into the mud. Hey! She gasped, reeling back, perturbed by his action. What is he thinking? Does he know how cold it gets at night? Sorry, we need to throw it in the river. If we're lucky, they'll find it and think we drowned. He pulled back and she quickly slid her arms out of the sleeves. Vincent grasped her jacket in his hands and launched it into the raging rapids. He then grabbed her hand and tugged her to her feet. Sarah stumbled on the uneven wet ground. What? She started as he dragged her into the water. The air whooshed out of her lungs as the icy water surrounded her. Goosebumps rose on her flesh as she clenched her mouth shut to keep her teeth from chattering. She hoped Vincent knew what he was doing, because getting wet like this with a chilly night coming wasn't a good idea. Vincent grasped onto a rock as he led them through the waist-deep water. Sarah clutched his hand tightly, using her free hand to hold on to a log. The water pushed and pulled her in every direction, and she knew if he let go, she'd go careening down the riverbank. The water will help conceal our scent, he explained. He led them into a small cove with rocks and logs around it. Come here, he said, drawing her closer. Vincent pressed his back against a rock and pulled her into his chest to conceal them from their enemies. His arms snaked around her middle and she nearly screamed as he sunk down into the water until just their heads were above the surface. Sarah shivered as the icy water surrounded her. Her bottom lip trembled uncontrollably as she tried to speak. Stay still and quiet, Vincent instructed, out of breath. I told you they were down here, a man's voice said a few seconds later. So what? It's just a shoe. Another deeper voice could be heard. Does it matter, Chip? Yeah, Dad wants a body or a living person, Chip said, annoyed. You think they drowned? The deep voice queried. Not until I see a body, Chip snapped back, annoyed. It's imperative we find them. They are the Alpha's brother and his mate's sister. We're at war and they are valuable hostages. With Fernando Juarez dead, the Gulf Pacts need a leader. There is no way Dad is going to sit back and watch that kid Malachi take the reins. Then why did Dad make it look like they were dead? So the Harrises wouldn't look for them, Chip replied nonchalantly. There is no sense in risking your life for a body. You rescue the living, not the dead. Besides, we don't want the focus on us right now. Let them chase down Malachi while we rally our troops. We just need to keep the wolf and the girl alive, and then wait for the opportune time to strike. You want to head downriver? Yeah, you go on ahead. I'm going to call in another favor to Sheriff Morris. He certainly owes us enough favors. I'm going to have him lock down all the streets and exits out of the state. They cannot be allowed to leave. He already gave us that girl's body, the unnamed man said nervously. How much more is he going to do? Without question. If he doesn't want his dirty secrets out, he'll do everything we ask, Chip replied. Let's go downstream. They're around here somewhere. Sarah shuddered in Vincent's embrace as leaves crunched beneath sneakers, signifying the departure of the two men. She sighed and leaned her head forward on Vincent's shoulder. It's going to be okay, Vincent whispered. They think we're dead. Our family thinks we are dead, she whispered, peering up into his green eyes. They're not even looking for us, Vincent. How is that? Okay. It's not okay. But we have to use the information we have to come up with a plan. We know we can't trust anyone until we get far away from here. As long as we stay off the highways and out of sight, we'll be fine. We're going to get home, Sarah. I promised Dev and Lark I'd take care of you. I'm not breaking that promise, Vincent said with conviction. Sarah shivered. First, we have to get out of these woods. It's going to be dark soon. We'll find a spot to hunker down and hopefully get some food. At least water shouldn't be an issue, he said, chuckling. Vincent removed one hand from her torso and used it to scoop up water. He slurped loudly, waggling his eyebrows as he downed the liquid. Sarah scoffed and shook her head, unable to stop a small smile from slipping over her face. You know it's not really safe to drink that. You could get sick, she pointed out. Well, we either drink this or become severely dehydrated. We need water. She took a tiny drink herself. Tasted okay, but that meant nothing. Vincent had a point. They didn't have any other choice. He gave her a lopsided grin as she took another sip. She tore her eyes away from Vincent as she looked at the vast, forested landscape that surrounded them. For miles it appeared to be nothing but the trees and the river. The water splashed onto her face as her wet, blonde hair floated in the stream. The sun was setting, and they were both drenched. It was going to be a long, chilly night, but hopefully Vincent was right and their situation would improve. I mean it, Sarah, Vincent said quietly as he pushed matted, wet hair from her face. We're going to get home. Vincent grabbed a handful of red, ripe berries and plopped them into his mouth, nearly swallowing them whole. He trusted Sarah when she said they were safe to eat. She hummed contently next to him, her rosy fingers reaching out to pluck more from the bush. The tart juice from their treat slid down his throat and filled his empty belly. Perhaps it was all in his head, but as he consumed the food, his eyes seemed to focus more and his ears tuned into the woodsy noises surrounding them. An owl hooted to the right, and wildlife scuttled through the dirt in front of them. For the first time in 2 days he was feeling like himself again. We should find a place to hunker down for the night, Vincent suggested. Sarah nodded and finished chewing before asking, did we lose them at the stream? Vincent closed his eyes, focusing on the surrounding noises. I don't hear anything human. With any luck, they'll follow the water looking for us while we continue on in this direction. We should smother ourselves down with dirt and leaves to keep our scent masked. Sarah sighed as she wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her hands up and down her creamy flesh. We'll need to find some sort of shelter for the night, boulders or low-lying branches. Our biggest issue is the cold and still being wet. Vincent ran a hand through his matted hair. His short mass was mostly dry, but Sarah's long, tangled flaxen locks were another story. Her black tank top and camouflage pants were drenched as well. His clothes were no better. The waterlogged jeans and green tea still clung to his chest. If we can make it through the night, we should be okay. The days are still warm. We'll probably have to use each other's body heat though, Sarah prattled on as she picked another handful of berries. Body heat? A smirk slipped over his face at the thought, but he quickly shook it away. She hadn't meant it like that. Not to mention she was his deceased friend's girl. That would be wrong. We should keep moving until we find shelter. It will keep our bodies warm and blood flowing, Sarah continued as she picked the last of the berries. She divided them between her hands and offered him a handful. At least we know they want us alive. That will give us an advantage if they find us. Vincent nodded, holding out his hand as she deposited the fruit into his palm. I never pegged you as the outdoorsy type, Vincent observed. While he hadn't spent a lot of time conversing with her at the ranch, he had seen her daily. Sure, she went on the occasional horseback ride, but she was mostly inside and always wore cutesy, girly dresses and tops. Sarah shrugged. I don't mind being outside. I'd prefer a camper with a bathroom and shower, but I've roughed it before. She pushed a lock of hair behind her ear as she shifted back and forth. My dad was really into hunting. He's the one who taught us to shoot. We used to go camping at state parks 2 to 3 times every summer. She sighed, blinking her hollowed blue eyes. He used her distraction as an opportunity to appraise her injuries. She had cuts and bruises all over, but none of them appeared to be bad. Her pale skin was ghastly white, and he wondered how much longer she could go without proper food and rest. Sarah snapped out of her trance and met his eyes. We should keep moving. We stand around too long, our muscles will get stiff and we'll be too tired. Sarah plopped a berry into her mouth as she spun on her heel and continued on. They walked in silence for several minutes before stopping in front of a steep hill. Could you climb that as a wolf? She asked, pointing. Vincent followed her gaze. The cliff up was a steep 90% incline and too narrow for a wolf to climb up. Anyone who attempted the slippery 20-foot climb would have to do so by hand. No. We should make camp up there, Sarah explained. It looks like it will be hard to access the area from any angle. We could both get some rest. If the Lunas find us, at least we'll hear them ahead of time. It would give us the upper hand. Plus, it looks like there's a tree up there we could use for shelter. All right, let's head on up, Vincent shrugged. Sarah surveyed the wall for a moment before maneuvering to a different area. I think this is the best spot to climb up. She reached up and gripped onto a ledge with her hand and hoisted herself up. Vincent watched, impressed by her fluid movements. She really seemed to know what she was doing. He waited for her to get a safe distance ahead before following her. He spent a lot of time outside, but climbing as a human wasn't something he practiced often. Sarah had already covered half the distance. Damn, she is fast. He grasped the rock she had started on with his fingers and hauled his body up. You do lots of rock climbing with your parents? He asked. A little, but mostly camping and stuff. We never did anything too serious. Sarah chirped, grunting as she hauled herself over the top. She turned and looked vacantly down at him. The year they died, we were planning a trip to Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and Yosemite. Did you still go? Vincent asked. No, I didn't want to. Vincent reached the top, using his upper body strength to pull himself up. He stood erect and shook out his tired arms as they both took in their new surroundings. Sarah looked to her left, her jaw set firmly. Sensing that she didn't wish to continue the current conversation, he looked around the top of the ledge. It was small, but there was no other way up other than the way they came. A tight trail led down the other way, but from what he could see, the path was miles long. It would be safe for now. Sudden movement to his right caught his eye. A rabbit scuttled through the brush, causing Vincent's still hollow belly to grumble. The wolf in him tugged at his consciousness and fought the urge to shift. Crouching down, he stalked forward toward the creature. Sat tucked behind some brush, nibbling on a nut. He moved forward silently towards his prey, lunging and capturing the small animal in his arms. At least they would have some form of nourishment tonight. Sarah blinked her eyes, trying to control her emotions. Why did Vincent have to talk about my family? She didn't want to think about them, she couldn't. The pain was too fresh and made her numb. Too many people she loved were dead. If it weren't for her, Preston would still be alive. Stop thinking about them. She cleared her throat, tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, and spun around to see Vincent clutching a gray ball of fluff in his arms. Dinner? He asked, laying a rabbit at her feet. Is a fire a good idea? She questioned. A small one, just enough to cook over. Maybe dry our clothes off a little. We have to eat. Those berries helped, but we need actual food to sustain us. Don't know how long we'll be out here. We need to keep our strength up. Sarah nodded. I'll grab a few twigs for kindling. They worked together in silence. Sarah gathered wood and brush for a small fire as Vincent used his claws to prepare the rabbit. How do you think they took out Juarez? Sarah asked curiously, dropping down. As she positioned the twigs in a pile, Vincent set the rabbit on a makeshift spit and plopped down across from her. They probably took the fight to them as originally planned. I'm glad they carried on with their plans, he said as she struck two rocks together and started the fire. Sarah blew gently on the tiny sparks until they grew large enough to engulf the twigs in flames. She picked up an extra stick, twirling it between her thumb and forefinger. Yeah, I just wish we could have been there. I wanted him to pay. You want revenge? Vincent asked, surprised. Don't you? Sarah shot back. Vincent shrugged. To be honest, when this whole thing started, I was just looking out for Em and Marcus. I never imagined it would turn out like this. Want to make things right, but there is a right and a wrong way to do it. We lose ourselves in the process, then aren't we losing too? Sarah dug her nails into her palm to keep her emotions at bay. His depth surprised a part of her, yet his words infuriated the other. She wanted the Gulf Packs to pay for what they'd taken from her, for what they'd done to her. If Preston and Rick were still alive, maybe I'd think that way too. But they're not. The Gulf Packs abducted me, Vincent. You didn't hear the things your father's men were saying about Em and me. If Daniel hadn't been there. Her voice broke and she looked away. Emmett McKinley's men had been horrendous towards them. She shivered as she remembered their predatory eyes and lewd comments. Vincent turned the rabbit over the fire and then got up, coming to sit next to her. He placed his hand over hers. I'm sorry that happened to you. There are no excuses for what my dad or his men did or said. My father's men could be pretty ruthless, and I'm truly sorry that you had to experience that. Sarah shook her head as she stared into the tiny flames. A part of her Wondered how a man so evil could have such compassionate and good children. Had to have been Claire's doing. Devin, Daniel, Emily, and Vincent were so different from the man who raised them. So how do you like your rabbit? Medium? Well done. Rare. Vincent turned the meat again, keeping it close to the fire. I'd make you a fine pot of rabbit stew, but I didn't have time to get to the store. Sorry. I'd be happy to throw in some leaves. I hear they taste like spinach, he grinned. Sarah's lip quirked up before she could stop it. Medium sounds good. Good. I can't stand charbroiled food. Me either. She scrunched her face up in disgust. She couldn't stand burned food. Sarah scooted closer to the tiny fire, keeping an eye on the food and letting the flames warm her. Do you think Lark and Devin followed through with the ceremony? She wondered aloud. Vincent shrugged. I was supposed to be the best man. Sarah rolled her eyes, not really in the mood for his antics. There aren't best men in mating ceremonies. Well, regardless, I hope they followed through. They love each other and I want them to be happy. Sarah swallowed hard. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to see pictures when we get back. They'll all be dull of course since the life of the party wasn't there, but Vincent trailed off, his emerald eyes lighting with laughter. Must you turn everything into a joke? She grumbled. Lighten up, Sarah. We're in a tight spot, but it's going to be okay, he assured her, all the playfulness absent from his voice. Sarah sighed, keeping her gaze on the fire. She imagined how the mating ceremony would have been from what she remembered of Emily and Marcus. Lark would have been stunning in her dress, and with Natalia working on the floral arrangements, she bet the outside decor was just as beautiful. I think dinner's done, Vincent said, interrupting her thoughts. Her stomach rumbled loudly as she accepted the hot, wet piece of meat from Vincent's hand with a small nod. Eat, sleep, and remember tomorrow is a new day, Chapter 3. Sarah snuggled further into the warm pillows, enjoying the heat of the heavy quilts. A steady thrum thumped beneath her ear. The sound was soothing, but she couldn't quite place what it was. She moved her arm to hook it under her pillow. Her digits froze as they skimmed over a fleshy, hard plane. Sarah jolted up, throwing the covers back. The cool morning chill took her breath away. She wrapped her arms around herself and peered down at Vincent. He lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling in even breaths. A few scars were scattered over his pecs, but instead of taking away from his muscular torso, it made it more defined. He had a definitive six-pack, and a small patch of dark hair trailed from his belly button and into the plaid pants he was wearing. Wait, why am I looking at him like this? Averting her eyes, she surveyed the room. The bed was against the wall on her side, and the foot of the bed was positioned against the wall as well. She wanted out, she would have to crawl over Vincent. Great. Sarah bit her lip and ran a hand through her gnarled golden locks. Vincent rolled toward her, his arm jutting out, wrapping around her hips as he buried his face into her side. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Oh my God, what is he doing? Stop stealing all the covers, he murmured. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears as she sat unmoving. After a long moment, she heard the quiet whistling of Vincent's snore. He was asleep. Carefully, she placed her hand over his, slowly lifting his fingers so she could wiggle out of his grasp. Once free, she stood up on her side, set his arm on the bed, and tossed the covers back over him. She inhaled sharply and closed her eyes, praying he wouldn't wake up. Sarah skimmed her foot over the covers, placing it on the other side of Vincent, and then lifted her other foot. She was almost there. She just needed to get down. Part of her wanted to stay in bed and go back to sleep in his comforting embrace, but the other part found it unnerving that she slept like that with him at all. Vincent's hand shot out from under the blankets, catching her ankle in midair. A scream bubbled up her throat as she lost her balance. She landed on Vincent's lap. His hand latched onto her hip as he rose. She screeched as he rolled her onto her back, pressing his forearm into her throat. Sarah gasped and struggled beneath his weight. Sarah? Vincent asked, confused, instantly moving his arm. He shot up, straddling her as his eyes widened with horror. She closed her eyes as she coughed. God, I'm sorry. There was movement over me. I was trying to get out of bed. I didn't want to wake you, she blurted, staring up into his emerald eyes. I didn't even think to check. Did I hurt you? he asked, his eyes glancing over her. I'm okay, she assured. It could have been someone else. And it could have been. At least he was prepared and on alert, even when he was resting. Vincent stiffened over her and cleared his throat. Heat crept over her face, burning all the way to her ears as she realized their position. He was nestled between her thighs, his chest pressed against hers with his face mere inches away. Sorry, he said as he peeled himself off her. He got out of bed and walked to the fire, grumbling something under his breath. Vincent picked up the poker and jabbed at the ashes. Sarah lay back on the pillows for a moment. Her body was on fire and butterflies fluttered through her belly. Her body had reacted to him and that scared her. Our clothes are dry, Vincent said as he checked the clothesline that hung next to the fire. He slipped his green shirt on. And we still have berries. Breakfast. He turned to her with the wooden bowl of fruit in hand. Sarah gulped, her eyes inadvertently dipping down to take in his torso again. Realizing she was checking him out, she snapped her eyes up to his. She needed to get out of this house. Sounds good, then let's go for that walk. You can show me what you found. Vincent led Sarah to the top of the mountain, watching as she neared the edge. She was silent for a long moment, staring off into the distance. He couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was. His body stiffened as he recalled how she'd felt pinned beneath him earlier. What was that? What had started out as an awkward situation had quickly escalated into something so much more. She was still Preston's girl and Lark's sister. She was also grieving. It would be wrong to give in to temptation. He looked at Sarah. She stared absently into the distance. She'd been silent the entire walk. In fact, Sarah hadn't spoken since, suggesting they go for a walk. The silence reminded him of those awkward times he'd accidentally fallen asleep at a girl's house, except nothing had happened. With Sarah, not really anyway. Having Sarah pressed against him had felt good. She fit perfectly. He clenched his jaw. Okay, maybe it wasn't nothing. Sarah was not like the girls he took home, and he wouldn't hurt her like that. She had enough going on and he cared about her well-being. So stop thinking about her like that and be her friend. Start a conversation. Talk to her. End this silence, he berated himself. Nice view, he said, hoping to clear the air. I wish I had my camera, she whispered so quietly he almost didn't hear her. You enjoy taking pictures? He asked curiously. I wanted to study photography. Wanted to? Sarah shrugged. I haven't touched my camera recently. Besides, there isn't much you can do with that. There are weddings and parties. Sarah pulled her hair up and tossed it over her shoulder, then ran her hands through the strands. Right, and I'm sure my clients will understand why I need to have bodyguards, she snapped. You're being antisocial again, Vincent teased. No, I'm being realistic. Look at Lark. I know the regulars have noticed the man candy at the bakery the past few months. She can get away with it, it's a shop. But for me to go to weddings or parties, how would I explain that? Sarah asked quietly. Where there is a will, there is a way. Sarah turned to face him. Her blue eyes misted with unshed tears and she swallowed hard. My mom bought me my camera. She taught me how to develop film and run Photoshop. She did freelance photography stuff every once in a while. So she knew everything about photography. I stopped taking pictures after she passed. Preston, her voice broke, got me to pick up my camera again. We spent a lot of time going out and taking pictures. I made new memories with him and now he's gone too. Every time I look at that camera, all I can think about is them. It used to be fun and now it's just a reminder of what I had. Vincent nodded in understanding. At least you can look back and reflect fondly on your time with them. I never did anything special with my mom or my dad. Mom spent most of her time with them, teaching her to cook. Dad, well, I'm not entirely sure that what he did with Daniel could be considered bonding or positive, but I was always a disappointment to him. He paused and let out a long breath, shifting on his feet. This conversation was getting entirely too deep for his liking. He didn't like to think about his relationship with his father, let alone actually talk about it with anyone. I guess what I'm trying to say is, at least you have good times too. Remember. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with her finger and gave him a small smile. Thanks. They both turned back to the scenery and remained quiet for several long moments. Vincent exhaled, pleased to have helped her a little. While they both came from extremely different backgrounds, they each were broken in their own way. For him, it was nice to relate to someone else other than his siblings. So, she started, breaking the silence. You said you could see a town? Yeah, over here, he said, leading her back into the trees. Sarah poked at the meat in front of her. Vincent caught a deer for dinner. The meat was tender and good, but she'd had more than her fill of it, and her stomach was heavy and full. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in days. Her stomach gurgled contently as she met Vincent's eyes sheepishly. Get enough to eat? Vincent asked as he continued to inhale his food. Yes, thanks. I thought your mom only taught him to cook. You seem pretty okay. Yourself, she said. Really? I've kind of been winging it. What about skinning the animals? She asked curiously. We'd hunt on our land back home. It saved money at the store and a trip into town. It also helped make sure no hunters ever came onto our land, well, most of the time anyway. We could eat it raw, but wolves can be territorial over their kills, so it was safer to send a few wolves in opposite directions and then have them bring it back for the entire pack. I could never do that part of it, Sarah shuddered. Too messy. Vincent nodded in agreement. Not my favorite part either. Sarah slouched back in her chair. We still haven't decided if we are going into town or not. There is no way for us to determine how far away it actually is from here. Not to mention the terrain looks rugged. I know. I'm just thinking that there are phones there. We could call Lark and Devon. We could go home, Sarah whispered. Then we'll head into town. Are you up for it tomorrow? Sarah stretched her limbs. They were still tender and stiff, but she wanted to go home. I can do it. We'll leave in the morning, Vincent agreed. Do you think we are out of the sheriff's jurisdiction? Sarah asked hesitantly. The last thing they needed was to run into more trouble when they were so close to freedom. I don't know. We'll have to play it safe and keep a low profile. I'm game for whatever we have to do as long as it gets us home, Sarah replied. We'll be on our way before you know it, Vincent assured. Do you think they have any hope at all for us? Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked rapidly to keep them from falling. They showed them bodies, Sarah. I don't think they had any other option other than to believe we are dead, Vincent murmured. I know once they find out about us, they'll do whatever it takes to get us home. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. Sarah stared down at his large, calloused hand that dwarfed her own. The gesture was reassuring. A small smile pulled at her lips and she sighed. It occurred to her they'd spent so much time trying to get home they hadn't wondered if everything back at the ranch was okay. Her stomach twisted as worry entered her mind. Nausea curdled in her belly, churning uncomfortably. Do you think everyone there is okay? Vincent squeezed her fingers. I don't know, but I hope so. Regardless, we are going to get through this. You and me together. We'll deal with everything as it comes. Let's not think about things we can't control. You're right. We could talk about the things we can control. Like, what will you do when we get back? Go to school. I don't know, she answered honestly. I've already deferred the first semester of school. It's already started. What about you? I'm supposed to be looking out for you. Looks like you're deciding for the both of us. You're my babysitter? She stiffened, yanking her hand out of his grasp. So, he's just looking out for me out of duty, not because he cares. Anger swelled in her at the thought. Here I thought we'd been sharing a connection of some sort. I thought Lark and Dev told you, Vincent said. No, they didn't, she snapped. They probably just hadn't gotten around to it yet, he surmised. You don't need a babysitter, Sarah. You can take care of yourself. I've seen what you can do, Rambo. They're just worried about you. With everything going on, you can't blame them for that. Sarah stood up and walked to the fire, watching as the orange flames flickered over the burning log. I just want this to be over. I should be able to go to school, to go out and live without having to worry about being kidnapped by misogynistic werewolves. I'm offended. Vincent placed a hand over his chest dramatically. I'll have you know that I'm fun. The life of the party. You don't want to go to college without me. Think of all the things we could get into. Sarah smiled despite herself. Yeah, like watching your womanizing ways. College is good for that, he smirked, pointing at her. We could be each other's wingmen. Sarah snorted. Maybe you can have sex with a complete stranger, but that's not for me, she answered honestly. Vincent studied her for a long moment. So I'll help you find a nice guy to date. Sarah chewed on her lip. She felt guilty even thinking about dating again, and the incident with Vincent this morning had been eating at her conscience all day. Relief washed over her as she considered what he just said. Maybe whatever attraction she felt earlier was one-sided. Good. It would make things easier. Maybe I could help you find a nice girl to date, she shot back. I don't know about that. One girl being faithful, not my style. Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet. Vincent chuckled. Let's get you to college and then we'll worry about both of our social lives. You're really intent on this school thing. Are you sure there isn't an ulterior motive there? She quirked her brow up at him. I already told you my motive. Sarah sighed and ran a hand through her hair. I'll think about it. Vincent nodded. I'm going to hold you to that. Sarah unclipped her clothes from the makeshift clothesline in the shack and shook out her stiff pants. It had seemed silly to wash her clothes 2 days in a row given the work that went into it, but she didn't know when they could get cleaned up again. Unfortunately, there was only the one PJ set for them to wear. They were both scantily clothed and damn it, he looked good without a shirt. She bit her lip as Vincent took his shirt down and slipped it on over his head. Hesitantly, she slid her camouflage garment on and buttoned. Vincent gave her a lopsided grin and wagged his eyebrow as he handed her the black tank top, but turned his back to her as he took his jeans off the line. Sarah's breath caught as he lowered the waistband of the plaid pajama pants down and she got a glimpse of his tight ass. Oh my God, he's going commando. Heat erupted over her face, and she promptly spun around as her pulse roared in her ears. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons on her shirt as she removed the garment. Her hand trembled as she yanked her top over her head and covered herself. Are you decent? Vincent asked. Yeah, you, Sarah asked, untucking her long locks from the back of her shirt. Yep. The floorboards creaked as he spun around. Sarah turned slowly to face him, but couldn't quite meet his gaze. She cleared her throat. I'm going to pack up in here if you want to go collect the water and berries. I'll be back in a few, Vincent agreed. I should be ready by the time you're done, she called after him. Holler if you need me. Sarah nodded to his back and busied herself packing up the emeries and a few blankets in a book bag she'd found stuffed under the bed. Guilt gnawed at her conscience. Stealing wasn't right, but she and Vincent needed the supplies to ensure their survival. If they got back when they got back, she would find some way to send money or fresh supplies to the property owner. She was so engrossed in her thoughts that she barely heard the door to the cabin click open. That was awfully quick, she commented as she tugged the zipper shut on the bag. Footsteps creaked across the floor, but Vincent said nothing. Sarah's hand stilled. Her heart lurched painfully in her chest as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Slowly she turned around. A man with long, greasy jet black hair stood in front of her. He was at least a foot taller than her and, judging by his bulging muscles, it wouldn't take much for him to overpower her. I need to yell to Vincent. Her eyes darted to the door, and in a vain attempt she sprinted toward the opening. A long muscled arm caught her about the waist and slung her backwards onto the bed. The air whooshed out of her lungs as her back connected with the metal headboard. She gasped, forcing air into her chest. Vincent, she croaked, hoping the other wolf would hear her as the man in front of her whipped out restraints. The man leered at her and she scooted to the edge of the bed, cowering away from him. Think, Sarah, think. Preston had shown her a little self-defense, but she was nowhere near as trained as Lark was. I should have spent more time picking up training instead of being lost in a funk. A hand jutted out, snatching a hold of her wrist and yanking her off the bed. Sarah let out a startled yelp as pain ricocheted up her arm into her shoulder. I have to get free. Fight back. Don't make this easy for him. On instinct, her foot lifted and flew toward the man's crotch. The man grunted and recoiled from her. She opened her palm and smashed it into his nose. Sarah grabbed the bag and darted out the door. She had to find Vincent so they could get out of here. She panicked, realizing she did not know where he was or if he was okay. Chapter 4. A few minutes prior, Vincent continued his walk down to the water. The branches swayed lightly in the breeze. It was peaceful out here. He didn't like leaving the wilderness behind for the city, but understood Sarah's need for normalcy and safety. They needed to get back home before they were captured. Mockingly, the wind blew again, carrying with it the smell of sweat and body odor mixed with dried leaves in the air. Luna's men had found them. He could make out two unfamiliar scents on either side of him. Are the wolves surrounding Sarah as well? The woods were quiet, and he doubted Sarah would go down without so much as a peep. She was okay for the moment, but her immediate future depended on how he handled himself against his two stalkers. It was imperative he keep them away from Sarah. He clutched the water bottle in his hand, flexing his fingers and willing them to partially change into claws. Protecting Sarah was his priority. The bones cracked and hair sprouted out as the nails elongated. He grimaced and suppressed a grunt, hiding his transformed hands against him. His best bet was to keep leading them away from Sarah. Her cuts and bruises were finally looking better. The last thing he wanted was to see her hurt again. He just had to get a little further away from the cabin. A twig snapped behind him as one of his stalkers, knowingly or not, alerted him to their presence. He froze and held his breath. The air was silent for a split second as all three of them realized each other. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly as they all waited for someone to make a move. Vincent gritted his teeth as footsteps stampeded toward him. He spun and dodged out of the way of his burly attacker and then kicked him to the ground. The man snarled and jumped to his feet, his golden eyes narrowing as he lunged, claws outstretched. Vincent caught him and shoved him away. He glanced toward the second man, who was sprinting up to the house. Sarah. His assailant took advantage of his distraction and tackled him to the ground. Vincent's back thudded against the dirt. He let out a pained yelp as something sharp poked into his lower right side. Warmth spread under his shirt and he cursed under his breath. The cut didn't feel too deep. At least he didn't think it did. A fist flew at his face, and he instinctively raised his hands to deflect the blow. He'd become a master at blocking an attack. Who would have thought his dad had actually taught him something beneficial, just in a roundabout way? Still, his body could only take so much. Even if he was deflecting most of the shots, his arms still throbbed from the assault. He would need to take the offensive soon. The man punched his forearms repeatedly. Still, Vincent held his position, protecting his face and body, and waiting for an opening. The man paused and Vincent struck out with his clawed hand, jabbing his nails into his enemy's chest. Vincent lifted his other arm and sank his elongated digits into the man's throat. His assailant's eyes widened as he pitched forward. Vincent caught him and rolled the limp body away before the dead weight fell onto him. Vincent! Sarah's choked voice called out. He pushed to his feet and raced to the shack. Fear squeezed his heart and he prayed she would be okay when he reached her. The trees whirled by him as he sprinted to Sarah, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd promised to protect her, and he would not let her down. Sarah scrambled out of the cabin as panic consumed her. She had to get away. Her feet tangled as she moved and pitched forward, landing on her hands and knees in the dirt. The bag fell from her grasp and rolled a few feet away. A cloud of debris kicked up into the air and she coughed as it went up her nose. She had to keep moving. Capture was not an option she would consider. She swiped the back of her arm across her face and looked up at her surroundings. A brownish coat caught her eye in the masses of red and yellow leaves. She paused since the color was like Vincent's, but this wolf's fur was redder. The wolf seemed to size her up. Sarah took the few precious seconds to survey her options. She couldn't outrun it, and she certainly wasn't leaving Vincent behind. That meant somehow she would have to fight it off until Vincent got back. He couldn't have gone far. Where is he? She scanned the area in search of her companion. Leaves crunched to her left and she peered over. Vincent's emerald eyes met hers. Wolf, she mouthed, pointing. The brown wolf bolted forward, causing her to gasp as it sprang at Vincent and dragged him to the ground. She held her breath, terrified it would hurt Vincent. The wolf snarled as the two wrestled. Vincent flipped them over, quickly gaining the upper hand. Sarah let out a relieved breath and quickly rose to her feet, looking for something she could use as a weapon. She was so concerned with her companion's well-being she didn't realize the presence behind her until it was too late. Rough hands embedded into her hair and dragged her to her feet. Sarah's hands flew to her head to get the man off of her. his arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her roughly against his solid chest. "Get off me!" she shrieked, flailing wildly but to no avail. "Think, Sarah, think. He's too strong for you to break free. He might be strong, but I bet it will still hurt like hell if you bite him." Sarah bent forward and bit into the fleshy forearm. Bile rose in her throat as the man tasted like stale, salty sweat and dirt. Her assaulter hissed, allowing his grip to loosen. Taking advantage, she lifted her foot and slammed her heel into the top of his foot. He retaliated by swiping his long wolfish nails across her bicep as he released her. Blinding pain tore through her arm and she screamed as the thick nails ripped at her flesh as he tried to grab her with his clawed hand. "Get off her!" Vincent snarled, launching himself at her captor. The air whooshed out of Sarah's lungs as she was propelled to the ground. Her vision blurred and everything went black for a moment. She forced her eyes open and slithered across the dirt, away from the fighting. Once out of the way, she rolled over to watch the fight. Vincent was holding his own, but his opponent was much larger. A dark spot soaked through the back of Vincent's shirt, and she blinked, realizing he was injured. She prayed it wasn't serious. If something happened to Vincent, she would lose it. She had to help him. Sarah pushed to her feet, grimacing as a wave of dizziness pulled at her consciousness. She squeezed her eyes shut to stay awake. Blinking, she saw the brown wolf lying in a bloody heap in the brush. If she didn't get it together, she or Vincent could be seriously injured or captured. She forced her eyes to focus on the fight before her. Vincent's attacker tackled him to the ground and wrapped his hands around his throat. Sarah held her breath. He couldn't die, she couldn't let him die like this. Need a weapon. Her eyes darted around the forest at the trees and brush that surrounded her. A large branch dangled from a tree, its diameter about the size of her wrist, but with long lean branches hanging off the end. Racing forward, she jerked the branch free of the tree and snapped the smaller, skinnier ends of the branch off with her knee. Heat crept up her leg from the action, but she ignored it. Sarah gritted her teeth as she hurried to Vincent, her makeshift club in hand. She clutched the branch above her like a baseball bat and positioned her body. Then swung. The man fell forward onto Vincent and she struck again, putting every ounce of strength she had into it. She'd be damned if anyone tried to kill Vincent. The man fell to the ground, cursing as she continued to assault him. To her dismay, he pushed himself to his feet with a grunt. Determined not to let him get up, she aimed again and lashed out, but her enemy caught it. He yanked on his end and pulled her to him. His grubby, calloused hand snatched her chin, squeezing to the point of pain. "You stupid little." A sickening crunch sounded, cutting him off. The man's eyes widened as he fell to his knees and then slumped to the ground. Vincent stood behind the man and caught him, tossing his body to the side before he could fall onto her. Sarah's stomach twisted as her gaze took in the odd angle of the man's neck and the vacant black of his eyes. "Sarah? Sarah," Vincent said frantically. "Sarah? Are you okay?" Vincent's warm hands cupped her cheeks as his emerald eyes searched her. His soothing touch brought her out of her stupor. I think so," she replied after a long moment. "We've got to go." His fingers trailed down her arm, taking her hand in his. "Can you run?" Sarah closed her eyes and nodded. She would not be captured if she had to run. Through the entire state of New Mexico she would. Anything was better than the fate the Lunas and Juarez had planned for her. She opened her eyes and met Vincent's gaze. "We're going to be okay," he assured as he bent down and picked up their bag. "Come on." He tugged her hand as he led them away. Vincent panted as they climbed up the side of a steep hill side by side. He was exhausted, but he was more worried about his companion. Sarah grunted as she climbed the rocky terrain. Her face was pale and blood covered the length of her arm. A fine sheen of sweat formed on her brow and she seemed unsteady on her feet. "You okay?" he asked breathlessly. "Are we being followed?" she asked. Sarah reached for a rock, but as her fingers circled around it, it pulled free from the dirt. She clawed at the ground trying to catch herself. "Sarah," he panicked, grasping her hand as she slid down. A cloud of debris fluttered down and he swallowed, realizing just how high they were. Jagged rocks loomed precariously below them. If she fell, she would die. "I got you," he assured as he held himself up with one hand and clutched onto her with the other. Her hand was warm and sticky. Blood oozed between their entwined fingers and he looked down at the long claw marks that marred her upper arm. There was so much blood. He wondered if she would lose consciousness from blood loss. She needed medical care. Sarah used her free hand to latch onto a rock and find her footing again. I think I'm good now, she hissed, her face contorting into a grimace as she gingerly moved her injured arm. You sure? He wished there was more he could do for her, but right now it would have to wait until they got to the top. She would make it to the peak, no matter what. He'd carry her on his back if needed. Sarah flexed her digits in his palm, groaning slightly. Yeah. Cautiously he released her hand. We'll rest at the top for a minute. We're not being followed. At least not yet, he thought. The blood covering her arm was like a calling card to Luna and his men. They could smell it for miles. First they needed to get to the top of the hill, and then they could figure out how to cover her scent. Good, she huffed as she continued along. They maneuvered their way up in silence. Vincent reached the peak first and rolled himself over the top. Twisting, he reached his hand down to Sarah. Her warm, slender fingers grasped his as he tugged her up beside him. They collapsed on the ground next to each other, their breathing ragged and uneven. Vincent stared up at the bright blue sky, watching as the puffy white clouds rolled above them. Judging by the position of the sun, they'd been running from the lunas most of the morning. His lungs burned and legs throbbed from the grueling workout. How is your arm? He asked, rolling his head to look at her. She lifted her arm and let out a long, pained breath. The bleeding has stopped. Her head swiveled and their gazes met. What about you? Are you okay? Vincent paused, taking a moment to assess his injuries. Heat crept over his back, and the longer he lay, the stiffer his muscles became. He would live, though. I'm okay, but we need to keep moving. They will not stop, Sarah mumbled, looking back up at the sky. They'll just keep coming. We can't keep this up. Hey, Vincent said, taking hold of her uninjured arm. We're not giving up. Sarah swallowed, her bottom lip trembling. I thought he was going to kill you. I'm not dying, Sarah. He squeezed her hand. You don't know that, she whispered. I've lost my parents, Rick and Preston. They all thought the same thing. I can't live with the guilt of another person's death on my conscience. Vincent sat up and pulled her with him. I promise you, Sarah, we are going home, both of us. She shook her head, a single tear rolling down her pale cheek. Don't make promises you can't keep. We're going to make it home, he insisted. There was no way he was going to let her down. Together. I promise you. I can't lose anyone else, Vincent. I don't want to lose you too. A sob tore out of her throat. Unshed tears pooled in her sapphire eyes, and he knew everything was finally crashing down on her. He needed to reassure her. You won't. We do this together. I won't leave you alone. We go home together. Or we go down fighting together. I'm not giving up on us, not until my last breath. If you don't go home, neither do I. What do you say? I'm in. We get home together, or we fight till our last breath together. Refuse to be a breeder. I'll die first. Whatever happens, I'm right here with you, he promised. He wouldn't let Sarah down. Even if he had to come back from the dead, he would be there for her. Vincent reached up and pulled her to him. Sarah relaxed into him and wrapped her arms around him, clutched him tightly. They were going to get home, but first they would have to run again. The smell of wolves drifted in the air a moment before he heard them. They're up here, a male voice called. I thought you said they weren't following us, Sarah murmured into his shoulder as she stiffened. You have to remember, wolves have a keen sense of smell and move fast. Vincent pulled away from her, but kept his hands on her elbows. No rest for the weary. On the bright side, at least we're getting a great workout. I think you're getting some muscles in your arms. He squeezed her uninjured bicep playfully. Seriously, Sarah huffed, exasperated. We are running for our lives and you are commenting on my muscle tone. Vincent chuckled, helping her to her feet. His limbs screamed at the movement. As his muscles tightened painfully, he took a step forward, his stride stiff. Come on, let's keep our head start. Sarah clasped their hands together, and they both took off at a steady jog. A thicket of trees was ahead to their right. While the wolves could smell them, it would at least give them some cover. Taking the lead, Vincent steered them in that direction, pushing the dense foliage out of the way. The trees and brush in this area were still full, but the leaves were vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows. Voices shouted behind them and he sprinted faster, willing his aching legs not to give out. If Sarah can keep moving, so can I. I just promised her we'd see this through together. That's one promise I'm not breaking. The pair came across a fallen log. He leaped up on it, then turned to pull Sarah up before jumping down to the earth together. Leaves and twigs crunched behind them and they sprinted, Sarah falling in stride next to Vincent. In the distance he could hear something roaring and prayed it wasn't what he thought. Yet there was nowhere else for them to go. Light poked through the trees and he could see the drop-off up ahead. His heart plummeted and dread filled him. Why can't anything go our way? How well do you swim? He asked as the swirling sound of water became louder. I'm okay. Why? She shot back wearily. We're going to go for a swim, he stated as they came out into the clearing. The trees stretched on for a few more yards before the drop-off he'd feared would be there. The sun shone brightly and he slowed their pace as they approached the edge. The water looked deep enough for the 20 or so foot plummet. The depth wasn't the issue. It was the rapid current that could be a challenge for them, especially in their weakened state. Will Sarah be able to swim in the rapids? Sarah sucked in a deep breath as she peered over the edge. At least we'll get a bath. He winked as he wiped at a smudge of dirt on Sarah's cheek. We are really doing this? She asked quietly, averting her wide-eyed gaze to the raging water below. Together. He quirked his brow at her. Together, she nodded. Vincent squeezed her hand tighter. They were really going to do this. He sucked in a large gulp of air and after one last look at Sarah they plummeted off the edge into the swirling water below. Chapter 5. Sarah gasped as the icy water hit her, causing a burst of pain to jolt up her legs from the impact. Water invaded her mouth as she went under and Vincent's hand ripped away from hers. The water swirled around her ferociously. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fought to push herself to the surface. The effort was in vain as the rapids pushed and pulled her in every direction. But up. Swim up. Her body listed to the side, and she kicked her feet to fix her positioning. The sun shone brightly above, illuminating the way to the top. Terror filled her as she fought to get to the surface. I will not drown. Sarah thrashed her arms down and propelled herself upwards. Like a torpedo, her head popped out of the river and she sputtered, expelling the water from her lungs. The river raged around her, sloshing into her face as she treaded water, fighting to stay afloat. Vincent! She screamed out between coughs. She grasped onto a floating branch and hauled herself further out of the water. Sarah searched frantically for her companion. Vincent! Sarah! She spun around. Relief flooded her as Vincent swam against the current toward her. Her joy quickly turned to panic when she noticed the bag was still on his back and the current was forcing it over his head, making it hard for him to move. Vincent panted breathlessly as he fought the current to get to her. Help! Him! Sarah used her hands to paddle closer, praying he didn't go under. He reached out and clung onto the branch with her. You okay? He asked, running a hand over his face. Yeah, you. He nodded, his eyes drifting to the hilltop they jumped from. We need to get moving before one of them musters up the courage to jump in after us. Sarah followed his gaze and shuddered. Is it really too much to ask for the Lunas to leave us alone? She just wanted a chance to rest, to be safe again. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option. 6 men stood watching them. One of them was pointing and saying something to the others, but she couldn't tell what he was saying. Vincent was right, they needed to get a move on. They were sitting ducks there in the water. Help me get to shore, Vincent said. He clutched the limb with one arm and used his other as a paddle. Sarah mimicked his action and, after a few strenuous moments, they reached the other side. Vincent climbed out of the water first and then offered his hand to her. Sarah squeezed his fingers tightly as the water lapped at her hips. She stumbled in the water as her boots sunk into the murky ground. Vincent tugged on her arms harder, yanking her free of the muddy embankment. She fell into his embrace, and he quickly righted her. He took her hand in his and led them off the shore. Can you run? He asked. Sarah's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she nodded. She was freezing. The word hypothermia popped into her head and she shuddered. Goosebumps covered her flesh, and she noted Vincent's lips had turned purple from the chill of the water. Regardless of the cold, they had to keep moving. At least the movement would keep their blood flowing. Come on. Vincent hauled her the rest of the way out of the water, never once releasing her hand. She glanced back to the hilltop again. The men still stood watching. She and Vincent needed to leave. For all they knew, more men were coming down to the river to greet them. Come on, Vincent urged, pulling her forward into the cover of the trees. Vincent collapsed against a tree trunk and ran his forearm across his sweaty brow. He let the bag fall off his back onto the ground, glad to be rid of the extra weight. Sarah, hunched over, brought her forehead to her knees. He was impressed with Sarah. Having spent a lot of time at the gym and training at the Harrises, he considered himself in peak physical shape. But the pace and intensity were taking a toll on him, and he had accelerated abilities. He couldn't even imagine how she felt. Sarah groaned as she slowly lowered herself to the ground. Exhaustion must have taken over because the next second she was on her butt. I don't think I can move another inch. Me either, he panted, slouching down against a tree for support. He leaned his head back against the bark and closed his eyes. The tree was oddly comfortable. He could very well fall asleep right against it. You know, the town was in the opposite direction, she stated quietly. I figured, he mumbled, too tired to open his eyes. We can't keep running. This pace is too much, she choked out between pants. You're not thinking of giving up, he warned. He opened his eyes and fixed a pointed look on her. No, she snapped. We need to change tactics. What did you have in mind? Vincent inquired, genuinely interested. They needed a plan. Well, we know they want us alive, or at least they did a few days ago. We still have the upper hand. Vincent nodded. The men he fought hadn't been going for the kill, which was why he was alive and they were dead. He was a skilled fighter, but taking on a wolf in human form was no easy feat. Do you think we could pick them off? Sarah asked. Maybe we could get a cell phone. Depending on the size of the group they are in, it's a possibility. If we got a cell, we could call Dev. What do you want to do? Sarah asked. We can't keep running in circles. Are you up to it? Vincent appraised her. She looked exhausted. Dark circles had formed under her eyes. Her skin was pale. Fresh cuts and bruises covered her arms. Let's rest for the night first, she said wearily. Vincent moved over to her and sat next to her. Can I see your arm? She twisted, giving him access to the tender laceration. How bad is it? Vincent gingerly touched the gnarled flesh as he examined her. It wasn't bleeding anymore, and the water rinsed most of the blood away. It doesn't look too bad. Stitches would be a good idea, but we don't have any, she finished. You'll just have to take it easy, Vincent suggested. Did you pack anything we could wrap it up with? I only brought blankets, she whispered. That'll work. I'll rip off a piece from the end so we can still use it for warmth. The last thing we want is for you to get an infection, Vincent said worriedly. He opened the bag and pulled out the edge of a blanket. Using his strength, he quickly tore off a piece and wrapped it around her wound. This will just keep out dirt. You really need to go easy on this. Yeah, I'll get right on that, she grinned. He loosely tied the ends of the blanket together. All done. Sarah stood up and grimaced as she shifted on her feet. How is your back? Saw blood. I just hit it funny on something in the woods. Nothing too serious. Once we stop for the night, I'll shift and be good as new. And boy, was he looking forward to that. His body hurt. Sarah rolled her eyes and grumbled. Must be nice to shift and magically be all better. I wish there were more we could do for you, he said earnestly. He had an unfair advantage over her. He couldn't imagine what she was going through. She was tougher than she looked. We should find a spot to camp for the night. I don't think we should start at fire. I agree. Vincent got up too. The movement was too quick for his aching body. Though, and his muscles tightened, sending a sharp pain shooting through his calf. He flexed his leg to work out the kinks and then stumbled forward, leading the way. You did pretty well back there, he started, wanting to fill the silence. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm lucky he didn't hurt me any more than he did. You trained with Preston, right? He asked without thinking. She froze for a moment and stared down at her feet before continuing on. Little. Things didn't get really bad until after he passed. We mostly went riding or running together, she answered quietly. Well, that explains your endurance. There have been a few times I've been afraid I would keel over. I'm not sure how you do it, he said desperately, trying to change the topic. They'd finally begun to really get along. The last thing he wanted was for her to clam up again. Adrenaline. If you faced a life of being a breeder, you'd run like hell too. Besides, I enjoy running, she whispered. Yeah. It's freeing. Especially when you're out in the wilderness like this. The air is fresh and you're surrounded by wildlife. She paused as they came to a clearing. You'd make a good werewolf. I can't even describe the high you get when you run as a wolf. It's exhilarating. Your perception of the forest changes. Everything is more vivid, louder and brighter. That sounds nice. Too bad werewolves are born, not made. I could totally see letting myself be turned. If it were that easy, I'd bite you in a heartbeat. Wow, that sounded stupid. Even to me. I need to put some sort of filter on. Sarah laughed and looked at him with one brow lifted in question. That came out differently than it sounded in my head, he acknowledged as heat engulfed his face. Sarah smiled as she slowed down and took in their surroundings. This would be a good spot to camp. Vincent looked around too. She was right, this was a good spot. The ground was flat and large trees engulfed them. A rock to their right would be a good shelter from the winds, and he could hear the rustling of water not too far off in the distance. Now the only question was, would it be safe? He narrowed his eyes, listening intently to their surroundings. The leaves rustled in the wind. A few forest animals chirped in the distance. He inhaled sharply. I don't sense anything other than natural wildlife. Good. We'll camp on the other side of these rocks. Sarah pulled the blanket up under her chin and shifted closer to Vincent. Her clothes were damp, and she was shivering uncontrollably despite the too thick blankets covering them. Thankfully, the backpack had kept most of the moisture from the blankets. It made sense to have a waterproof backpack while camping. She was just thankful it worked. Vincent slowly, almost nervously, reached out and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. Her head rested on his shoulder, and his hand moved up and down her arm. Heat radiated off his body in waves and she snuggled impossibly closer. Gosh, does he feel good. It was more than just warmth though. It felt good to be curled up against his body. She bit her lip, hating that she felt that way. They were, well, she didn't know what they were, but in this situation it would be easy to complicate things, and mixed emotions and confused feelings were the last things they needed. Instead of focusing on Vincent, she focused on the night sky. The air was chilly, cool enough to see tiny white puffs with each breath she drew. She looked up at the bright white stars and relaxed. Crickets chirped around them and she could hear the steady thrum of Vincent's heart, a comforting sound she could fall asleep to. Are you warm enough? Vincent asked. Getting better, she smiled. Vincent really had been fantastic throughout this entire ordeal. If it weren't for him, she'd have been captured for sure. He'd been with her through all of her torment and she acted like a bitch for the most of it. She should acknowledge everything he's done. Maybe they could start fresh. Thank you for everything. I really appreciate it. I know I haven't been easy to get along with. I'm sorry, she told him earnestly. It's okay. You've been through a lot. So have you, she countered. It wouldn't be fair for him to let her off the hook that easily. You were right about me. I tried to keep you at arm's length because I was afraid. I don't want to get close to someone and go through that pain again. She sucked in a deep breath and let it out. I can't imagine what it's like to lose both parents, a father figure and your boyfriend. But I know how lonely it is when you shut people out. You don't have to do it alone. There are people back home that are there for you. I'm here for you, Vincent assured. Sarah blinked up at the sky, absorbing his words. She knew Lark was there and Jean, who was like a brother to her, but they had enough on their plates as it was without having to deal with her too. But she wasn't the only one who had lost someone. Vincent had lost his father too, she realized. Even though he'd been an awful man, Emmett McKinley was his dad. Do you miss him? Your dad. She bit her lip. Sarah wondered if she'd crossed a line, but they were being honest with each other right now and she wanted to know why he seemed to avoid serious relationships so she could help him too. Vincent swallowed loudly, while his hand simultaneously quit moving on her arm. No. When I found out he was dead, I felt relieved. He made my life a living hell growing up. Everything I did was never good enough, and he let me. No. I remember a few years ago I went to the gym. I thought I could make myself quicker. He used to have us practice fighting against his most experienced men. I finally beat one of them and I was so proud. The only thing he said was I should have done it faster. No good job, nothing. In fact, he then ordered the other 3 men who were there to all spar against me. He sighed heavily. Let's just leave it at it didn't end well for me. And with all the stuff that happened with M, he was a monster. Emmett wasn't the type of man you negotiated with. He was intent on sending Emily to Juarez, and he would have hurt anyone who got in his way. On the bright side, his pigheadedness helped me, Dev, and Em become closer. Sarah stared off into the distance. Her parents always encouraged her. She couldn't imagine having them beat her down for trying her hardest. As the silence stretched between them, she realized Vincent probably didn't want to keep talking about his family. He probably needed to talk about it in small doses, just as she did with Preston. Lark and I were always best friends. Even though there was an age gap. After our parents, we bonded even more. I'm not sure what I would do without her. Dev and Em have always been close. Dev and I didn't really connect until I was a teen. Emmett was so hard on me, harder on him. Dev took me under his wing and taught me a lot of things my dad expected of me but didn't have the patience to teach, Vincent explained. I can't imagine growing up like that, Sarah whispered. I tried really hard to conform to his wishes, but one day I realized it would never be good enough, so I decided to be who I wanted to be. Once I stopped worrying about what he thought, it made my life better in some ways. Worse in others, he answered dejectedly. Sarah shifted in his embrace, staring up at the opaque black sky, wondering if they could both find peace. They both had their demons, and in small doses it wasn't so bad clearing the air. Tonight she didn't mind talking a little more. But it didn't change how you felt? You still thought you weren't living up to his expectations? She asked curiously. Vincent was always so silly, it was a rarity for him to be so open. While she wanted to know more about him, she didn't want to push too hard and have him not talk at all. You hear something too many times, you believe it. Developing a sense of humor was my way of coping. The thing is, everyone always laughs with you, but no one ever takes you seriously or wants to be your friend, he whispered. Dev was my only friend in high school, Daniel too, to an extent. But they were both ahead of me, and they didn't have friends either. Sarah's heart clenched painfully in her chest as she listened to him speak. Does he even know how much he's helped me the past few days? If you weren't here with me, I don't know where I would be. I don't know why. Your father couldn't see how strong, caring, and capable you are, but you've been my rock, Vincent. Thank you. She turned her head and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. His scruff grazed deliciously over her lips, causing her breath to quicken. She was so close to his thin pink lips. What would it be like to kiss him? What was that for? Vincent asked, jolting her back to reality. Sarah blinked and cleared her throat. She shook her head and mentally chastised herself for thinking about him like that again. Her heart raced and she closed her eyes, willing her body to calm down. Just, thanks for everything. You're my friend. And I'm glad to have you here with me, she stammered. What am I doing? Why do I keep having this reaction to him? Vincent kissed the top of her head, sending butterflies fluttering through her belly. No problem. Thanks for being my friend. Sarah closed her eyes and forced her frayed nerves to relax. She sighed contently as improper thoughts of Vincent fled her mind. Good night, she whispered.